Welcome back and welcome to 2024. So I thought that I would make a video to sort of ease into the new year by tackling a recent release in the Tone Poet series. Many folks know that I don't buy every single title in the Tone Poet series, but I did opt to go for this one. And what I wanted to talk about is Jack Wilson's Easterly Winds. So the reason why I decided to go for this one, despite the fact that it originally came out right in like 1968, I suppose, and therefore getting an original pressing like this one is not particularly difficult, although I will say that it's increasingly expensive as the years have gone by. But the reason why I wanted to still go for this one, this Tone Poet series, is because I am a huge fan of this record. Buying Jack Wilson's stuff when I first started collecting was almost one of the cheapest ways you could get into original Blue Note collecting, because his stuff really was, I suppose it was just overlooked. And hearing Easterly Winds was a great way for me to hear Lee Morgan, who I'm particularly fond of and who I couldn't hear otherwise for an affordable price, even when I started collecting, outside of his later work, right, in the Liberty era, similar to this one. So in any event, I'm like I said, I'm really fond of this record. I love basically every track. There's one that's like maybe not as much, but I'm just a big fan, and so I wanted to hear what the Tone Poet series would sound like, especially compared to the original. I'm not going to do really like a robust shootout though in this. I think I'll mention a couple of areas where I think that there is a difference between the Tone Poet and the Liberty edition, and I think that should suffice rather than doing a kind of a detailed track by track comparison, because what you're going to hear is that more or less they're pretty similar pressings, and more so than say other Tone Poets versus originals that are in the series. And so because they're so similar, I'm just not going to get into that much detail. So a couple of words, I suppose, about this album before we dive in is that it was recorded in September of 1967, so very much in the Liberty era. Like I said, this thing was produced by Duke Pearson, who was pretty active himself as a leader, but also had sort of acted as the A&R man and producer for a variety of Blue Note sessions, really, I think, since Ike Quebec passed away. Duke Pearson sort of took over, and so he was kind of at the reins of a lot of these really great sessions that were leveraging soul and funk in the kind of mid-60s era, and certainly as the Liberty acquisition kind of came to be. So anyway, yeah, so that's what we're going to talk about today. Let's dive in as usual. Please go ahead and hit subscribe. It helps me out quite a bit. Hit the notification bell so that you know every time that I post a video. And if you'd like, you can go over to Instagram and you can follow me over there. I post every day. And my handle is what_can_brown. All right, so the folks at Blue Note do an excellent job with the packaging of really every title in the Tone Poet series. I don't think I've had any issue with any of them, and this is no exception. So apologize for the glare. There's a lot of black, obviously, on this cover, and so it can be difficult to see. But really fantastic stuff. In almost every way it matches the original, and I say almost because just the one thing that they didn't kind of carry through, and I apologize again for the glare on this one. This one happens to be in shrink wrap, and I haven't removed it yet. But what you'll see here is like the sort of registered trademark, and it says Liberty Records, and that's printed in USA, and that's one of the things that they didn't carry forward into the Tone Poet edition. Otherwise, these things are pretty much the same. And one thing I wanted to call out, because a lot of these Tone Poets were, recorded in an era where the photography would have been likely black and white, and there's a lot of black and white photography used in the gatefolds of these things. But Easterly Winds in fall of 1967, well, I guess they just had a bunch of color photos, and so being able to get a Tone Poet edition with color photos in the gatefold still feels unusual to me, even though there's been other titles that have done it. I think each of the titles in this one were taken by Francis Wolff. So in any event, they did a great job with the cover as usual. So otherwise, Jack Wilson. So who was Jack Wilson? Well, he was a piano player. This is not his first record for Blue Note. It's actually his second. I believe his first one was titled Something Personal, which is an excellent one as well. But he didn't debut as a leader for Blue Note either. He had put out some records for both Atlantic, alongside Roy Ayers, I think for at least one or two of them, and also for Vault. And actually, I think despite the fact that the Blue Note sessions inevitably are going to sound better, right, than his work as a leader for some of these other labels. Perhaps my favorite album that Jack Wilson ever did is a album titled Ramblin', which was on the Vault Records label. And that's one that I don't think anybody's going to be reissuing anytime soon, but is definitely one that is worth you seeking out because it just really is fantastic. So, contrary perhaps to Something Personal, which is a little bit more subdued and didn't have as many horns, and I think actually had more titles or more compositions that were Wilson's, which would make sense if it's called Something Personal. This one does have, let's see, 1, 2, 3. So it does have 4 originals. It has one title by Frank Strozier, and then there's a Johnny Mandel song as well. So 4 original compositions and 2 that are not. And so even though I would say, especially the opening tune on this thing is pretty, I don't know. I think personally that it was written for radio play, and it's a little bit of, I hesitate to say throwaway, because I know there's folks out there who just, anything Blue Note puts out, you're not allowed to criticize it. But that opening track I think is the more commercial sounding piece, and that is one that he wrote. But every single other track on here, whether he wrote it or not, just feels like he does a very unique kind of treatment of it. And I think it's particularly impressive in this record considering that he has 3 horns. So he's arranging for 3 horns in addition to rhythm section. And so if I'm going to say that, how Jack Wilson is highlighted here, I think it's his compositional ability, his arrangements for, again, for a little bit larger of a group. And yeah, I mean, I think what he can draw perhaps out of these musicians, because when you get Lee Morgan and Jackie McLean in the lineup of one of your records, you want to make sure that you're using them as best you can into their full capability. And I think that he definitely does here. So that's a few sort of preliminary words, and what I do want to do is talk about each of these tracks and leave you with a couple of things. One is certainly what are my recommended tracks that I think you should check out, and there are a bunch of them because I'm a huge fan of this record. But also I'll try to get at maybe a little bit more of the feel of some of these tunes, who's highlighted in which tune, what to sort of listen for, and inevitably, does this sound better or worse than the original? All right, so let's start out with that beginning track. So the first one is simply titled Do It. And like I suggested, it is sort of the radio-friendly track on this album. So Liberty at this point, was obviously looking for charting pieces and albums, right? So they were trying to make money. I mean, Blue Note was always trying to make money. It's just that Lee Morgan gave them a taste of that with Sidewinder, a few other musicians with other records, and I think that they were after that in every single album going forward, maybe with few exceptions that were sort of more prestige pieces, if you will. But I think that the inclusion of that one and Jack Wilson's composition being featured here as the first track, I think was to catch the attention of the listener, was for radio play, and was supposed to be the commercial sounding tune, and it just is. It's a fairly relaxed tempo. It's definitely a toe tapper. It's sort of a soul, jazz, funk kind of blues forward piece. And what occurs to me, I think, immediately in this opening one is simply how straightforward it is. And like I said, it does have a catchy melody, but it also has solos that focus on simplicity as well. So it isn't just this kind of simplistic opening catchy melody and then the soloists get to do whatever they want. No, they stick very close to the changes. They're not playing anything that's very complex from a rhythmic standpoint. And I think, certainly they execute their solos very well. They're just not very innovative. At the same time, there's something to be said for a well-executed, somewhat commercial-sounding song. And it succeeds there. It's not a bad-sounding song. It's just unusual when you consider how personal some of the other tracks on this album sound. This one, you really don't get the personality of these musicians as much as you just get to hear how fantastic they can play. So Jackie McLean does take the first solo on this thing. He matches the style very well. Again, blues forward, pretty straightforward as well. He doesn't try to do anything too crazy. Lee Morgan takes the next one. he's kind of muted, I would say, even compared to his presence on any other track on this album. He sounds just a little bit different, a little bit more, I don't want to call it muffled, but maybe muffled is the best way I can describe it. He just sounds soft and maybe not particularly punchy. Now, one thing to note is that he doesn't sound better in the original pressing. It's just simply how it was recorded. Let's see. Garnett Brown is the trombonist here, and he takes over Lee Morgan's solo, borderline by force. And so one fun thing to listen for is really the transitions between the solos, almost across the entire album. There's a few other things I'm going to point out in a little bit, but when Garnett Brown takes over from Lee Morgan's solo and has his own solo, when I say he takes it by force, listen for what I mean by that when you listen to it, because Lee Morgan is done, and in the next beat, Garnett Brown is doing this kind of like vibrato, or maybe not vibrato, but like fluttering kind of thing with his trombone, and kind of like steals the energy, or steals the solo away from Lee Morgan. And I think it's kind of fun. Otherwise, his solo is pretty basic. He keeps it in the blues, and you know, like I said, the whole thing is catchy, and everyone executes their solos very well. It's not a bad introduction to this album. It's just that it's painfully obvious to me that it is the commercial piece of the album. All right, so track 2 on this thing is titled "On Children," and it's a huge highlight among many. So here, overall, the sound sounds a little bit, I'd say a little bit hotter. There's more detail, I think, in this piece compared to the previous one. It's interesting because in the previous one, the horns, when they're playing, there's almost this echoiness that again is like very sort of 60s and poppy kind of like sound, and they did away with that for the rest of the album. And as a result, it just sounds a little bit more punchy and a little bit more raw, and honestly a little bit more of what I like to hear when I listen to these Blue Note sessions. And so in any event, independent of just how the instruments sound, the overall piece is simply stronger, and it's just much more interesting. So let's see, if I'm to say where there's more detail, it's definitely in the percussion, and I think specifically in the rim hits. Jackie's solo here is a huge highlight of the piece, much more inspired than on that first tune, where they were kind of staying in the soul vein. You can hear, especially at the tail end of McLean's solo, he's actually leveraging some pretty unusual notes given the chord progression, and that just speaks to his ability to kind of hear notes in the chord that are a little bit unusual, and that he can leverage and kind of pull in and do something with. And it's interesting because when he does that the most is the measure right before Lee Morgan takes over. So if you think about this, and you think about the fact that Jackie McLean and Lee Morgan are both, you know, sort of some of the most exciting artists on the scene, and probably trying to challenge each other at this time, and whenever they play together, it's very interesting to me that McLean would try to pick out some of these unusual notes right before handing it to Lee Morgan, because what he's preventing Lee Morgan from doing is starting slow, or starting like, you know, with the root, say, of the chord, because it might sound a little bit unusual. And so what he's doing is like either challenging or giving Lee Morgan the opportunity to actually play something that's a little bit more adventurous, considering the chord progression, than maybe he otherwise would. And in some ways, I think he's kind of pointing Lee Morgan in a direction with his solo. And some of these like little nuanced things that you can sometimes hear in these performances, I think are just really, really exciting. It gives you something just a little bit more to kind of pay attention to. And I don't think you necessarily have to be a musician to hear at these handoffs necessarily what's happening, because it's just, you'll hear something that's a little bit different than what you'd expect. Jack Wilson takes over for Lee Morgan at the conclusion of Morgan's solo, and in some ways, with the way that Jack Wilson is swinging his sort of piano playing, he's playing fast, but in like a very narrow range. So, you know, within, say, you know, an octave, as opposed to kind of going up and down. In a way, it sounds like his solo is a little bit guitar-esque at times, so maybe that's something to look for in this piece as well. It's just kind of an unusual. I don't think it's anything that he was trying to do intentionally necessarily. It's just how it comes across. Is this more like, I don't know, this like very rhythmic, percussive, guitar-sounding piano solo, and I understand how weird that sounds. Otherwise, I think, so you've got the three horns here. I think there's a really nice balance across the horns here, which is credit to Jack Wilson's arrangement. It sounds great. I do think at the end of this thing, there's some weird sounding, like dampened Billy Higgins cymbal stuff. Just at the very end, it sounds a bit unnatural. And when I listened to it on this Tone Poet, I immediately had to go back to the original pressing because I was certain that there was like a dropout or something, but there isn't. It's just that this is not the only place that Billy Higgins uses some of this like kind of dampening to basically cut off any sibilants or any any sustains from the cymbals, and it sounds unusual. And I don't know how he did it, and it sounds to me at certain points like maybe he was using a different kind of brush because the brushwork sounds different in places. But in any event, again, just something to listen for, I guess, at the tail end of this thing. But again, I assure you, it does sound the same in the original pressing as well. So I will find myself saying something about every single track here, but fortunately, there's only 6. I just really like. I really like almost all of them, like I said. So A Time for Love is the Johnny Mandel piece that kind of closes out the first side, and it is absolutely gorgeous. It is a really nice tune. I hadn't listened to this album in a little bit before I got the Tone Poet in, and it just like, it's one of those that gives me goosebumps, right? This almost like nostalgia from having heard it years past. And I think it really highlights just how beautiful Jack Wilson could play the piano. There's a lot of space here. Billy Higgins' brushwork is really soft, whereas Bob Cranshaw's bass is actually much more present in the mix compared to the original. So in some ways in the original, this very much seems like a Jack Wilson feature, and the other musicians are very much at the back. And in the Tone Poet edition, I do think that Higgins' brushwork is still extremely soft. Like, I'm talking, you might have to like stand over next to the right speaker just to hear every little tiny thing that Higgins is playing because it's just not very present in the mix. But the benefit that we get with the Tone Poet edition is that Bob Cranshaw is much more present, and it is bassier and not in a distracting way. And actually, I think that's one of the biggest differences, if there are differences between the Tone Poet edition and the original, is the bass. And that's pretty consistent. I feel like I typically say that when I'm talking about Tone Poet editions. One of the things that Joe Harley and others will say is that Rudy Van Gelder used some amount of compression for the original pressings, and so sometimes you lose some of the stuff, and what they are able to do with the Tone Poet edition is more accurately represent the original master tapes, and it sounds like there was simply more bass to be heard in that mix, and so I think it's really exciting to be able to get that here and to have it come across as beautifully as it does. This is another place where I think Higgins' drums, his playing in some ways sounds really staccato, almost like the snare that he's hitting the brushes with is like really dampened. And again, I'm not a drummer. I don't know how he might have achieved that and whether it's intentional or whether it wasn't. I don't know how it would sort of supposed to be necessarily for this particular piece. But despite the fact that the drum work is not as audible and it's much more nuanced and you really have to listen to it, I still think that this piece, as it is just phenomenal, and it definitely sounds better on this Tone Poet edition. All right, so the title track, Easterly Winds, is also fantastic. Like I continue to say, this is just the strength of compositions here. I think what you're going to do is walk away from hearing this album, first time you hear it, and you're actually going to be able to recognize the melodies the next time you hear them. So many times with jazz compositions, especially in hard bop, the melody is almost this as an aside kind of thing, but let's get to the solos. There's great solos here, but there's every single piece here is just very recognizable, really catchy melody, really engaging melody, if not catchy. I don't mean catchy like, I don't know, sometimes people consider that like a 4-letter word, but they're very engaging melodies that really draw you into each of the pieces. And Easterly Winds, the title track, is one such piece. So one of the most exciting things here, and this may be my favorite composition of Jack Wilson's, honestly, is Jackie McLean's accent notes right at the beginning that just adds so much energy. Just really high energy horn chorus on this piece, and it sounds really good. Lee Morgan takes the first solo, sounds fantastic, really dynamic. McLean as well. His tone, I think, is best heard here. So if you think what Jackie McLean is supposed to sound like and what he sounds like on other albums where he is the leader, you get every bit of that rawness and that energy that he puts into his playing. You just really hear that here best compared to perhaps some of the other pieces on this album. He also takes, I think, maybe the most adventurous solo, certainly for him, but also I think compared to some of the other musicians on the album. So this is one where, again, you get more of his personality, and I like hearing the musician's personality, even within the context of these albums where there's, say, another leader. Jack Wilson takes a solo here that's really nice. He is a little bit more fun, I would say, than maybe Jackie McLean, simply in that Jack Wilson quotes a few other songs, including he quotes the melody from Anything Goes, which is kind of like just a fun sort of Easter egg or whatever to pay attention to. But yeah, just really, really nice. Like I said, I'm a fan of every single track, but that one is a highlight among highlights. All right, so track 5 is titled Nirvana, and it may actually be misspelled because they spell it with a double N there at the end, so NNA, and Jack Wilson can title it however he wants. However, this piece has been recorded before, and it was supposed to be part of, say, a suite. So this piece, Nirvana, was actually originally included on Jack Wilson's title for Atlantic with Roy Ayers, and it was called Nirvana and Dana. And so the two pieces are kind of put together in a suite, and in that version, he only has the one A. So in any event, this one is just one part of the suite, and it is Nirvana. And it is another gorgeous track. It's soft and sensitive. He's been playing this song pretty often, actually, and he recorded it in a session actually from the prior year that made the Jazz from the Penthouse release. So I don't know if folks remember this, but 3-4 years ago, 2020, during Record Store Day, there was this Jack Wilson release, and it's titled Call Me, Jazz from the Penthouse. Who put this out? I'm sure I know the label here. It's Light in the Attic that put it out. Century 67 Records, so maybe a partnership there. I had to get this when it came out in Record Store Day of 2020 because I love Jack Wilson. I love this lineup, which is Roy Ayers and Buddy Woodson and Vaughn Barlow. But also, they tackle many of the same tracks that we've heard elsewhere. So there's stuff here that ended up being on Something Personal. There's stuff here that ended up being on some of his Atlantic stuff, as well as Easterly Winds. And so I really enjoy being able to hear some of these excellent compositions with a different lineup. Right, this is a quartet lineup as opposed to the adding the horns, and because Roy Ayers is a vibraphonist who kind of plays some of the melodies here. But in any event, that's another opportunity to hear the track as well. And actually, he apparently, I'm learning things now. So he spells it with a double N-A at the end here as well. So I guess he just changed the spelling of it. So anyway, that's another place to hear this thing. What else to say? Lee Morgan sounds really, really nice. So this is a little bit sort of different structure compared to some of the other tracks that Jack Wilson includes on this album, where it isn't just the introduction of the melody or the head and then immediately go into solo. Jack Wilson has this kind of extended role to play where you almost think that this is going to be a trio, and then like halfway through the song or maybe even past that, Lee Morgan comes in with this just really lyrical, very lovely solo that I think adds quite a bit. So again, just another fantastic piece. All right, so that last one is titled Frank's Tune, and I won't say that much about that before I wrap things up. It is the longest one on the album. It's at 8 minutes, so some of these others are like between 5 and 6. So Frank Strozier was what did he play? Was he an altoist or was he a tenor player? In any event, he was a saxophonist, and now I have a memory lapse, but in any event, he was playing for VJ Records, and so it's possible that that's how Lee Morgan got a hold of this, or the fact that Lee Morgan's on this. It's possible that he brought the tune in. I believe Bob Cranshaw played for VJ at some point as well, so it's possible he brought the tune in, or maybe just Jack Wilson had played with Frank Strozier. But in any event, Frank's Tune is a great tune. It is recognizable. I've heard it elsewhere as well. It's fantastic. And I just think it's also a great way to, he's an altoist, by the way, Frank Strozier, it just popped in my head. It's just a fantastic piece, and it's a really like crisp arrangement. And again, it's another great example of layering of the horns. And I think that I just think that Jack Wilson does a really phenomenal job. It's not unusual, I would say, to have somebody who's an expert composer and arranger not necessarily have this like sort of long-standing career. If anything, it feels like the folks who had those long careers were the ones who weren't necessarily those, you know, who weren't like a G.G. Grice or somebody like that, who was more well known for their composing perhaps than their playing. Those weren't the people who were you know, continuing on. It was the virtuosic soloists, right, who continued to do well. And had careers that lasted decades, at least, provided that they were able to live that long. So it is unfortunate, though, because I think Jack Wilson really left so many wonderful pieces, and whether he composed them or whether he arranged them, like in Frank's tune. So overall, let's see, if I were to kind of sum things up, I suppose, on this album, what would I say? So I think it's a combination of things that I've already said, right? So I've already said that it really highlights Jack Wilson and his compositional and arranging ability. As far as the soloists, outside of that first tune, I think everyone sounds fantastic. There's a lot of great sort of dynamics, even like interpersonal dynamics between the musicians across each of these tracks that I think is really nice to hear. And I would say that the Tone Poet edition, and therefore I guess the master tapes, I think they do a really good job of highlighting each of the horns and Jack Wilson. So Jack Wilson is always present. He's never lost anywhere on this entire album. But there are a few circumstances where Billy Higgins' drums are a bit lost. And those are my words. It's possible that he was simply not meant to be included or, you know, as prominent on some of the pieces, and so he was a little bit more muted. But I do like that Bob Cranshaw's bass is more present here, and I do think that overall the Tone Poet edition is an improvement on the original. Now, the original sounds like a 60s recording in a few ways that I think some people will really enjoy, like the use of echo. And in some ways, in comparison, and because you don't have the same separation between the instruments on that original pressing, even the stereo edition sounds a little bit mono in comparison to the Tone Poet, which again obviously is in stereo. So I thought that was kind of an interesting point to notice, I guess, between these two. There's more detail in the drums here when you can hear the drums on the Tone Poet edition, especially because there's a significant amount of cymbal work by Billy Higgins. Now, it's not the cymbals are not. You know, they don't completely take over at any point. They don't drown out anything else. They're not overly obvious. It's just there's a little bit more detail in them compared to the original. And I think that having some of that sonic detail is really nice because there's a lot of dynamics that shift in this album in terms of musicians getting soft and loud and back to soft. And I feel like when you have the detail and when you have the stereo separation, the separation with the instruments, that some of those dynamics are just a little bit more noticeable and well, dynamic. And so I thought that was nice to hear as well. So I'm a fan of this, you know. But I also think that compared to some of the other Tone Poet releases, that this one sounds a little bit closer to the original. Just in comparison with some of those other titles. And that's not a bad thing, because there's a lot of people who, when they look for reissues, they want something that's going to sound as close as it possibly can to that original. And this one certainly does. There's not this wide gap between them. And if anything, like I said, there's some improvements. So those are my thoughts on this release. Like I said, I thought I'd try to take things a little bit easy and just talk about a new release. And maybe I'll get into some more controversial things for future videos. We'll see how that goes. I also have a couple of really exciting interviews coming up, so please look out for those as well. All right, that's it for now. Thanks very much for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.